Welcome to Torchbearers by College Esports News. My name is Kenneth, and on this show, we talk with those carrying the flame of college esports at programs across the continent to learn from their expertise in a particular segment of our vast ecosystem. In this episode, we get to talk to someone who's right in the middle of all of this D1 talk. His name is Dr. John Price. He's the current esports manager at The Ohio State University, a program participating in both the Big Esports Conference and the Power Esports Conference this semester. We talk about what these conferences can provide his program that others don't, and I think it helps shed some light on the decision-making of these powerhouse institutions. Stick around, though, because later in the episode, we transition into talking about balancing the needs of our current students versus the expectations of administration. This is my conversation with John. Well, John, welcome to Torchbearers OH.
IO. It's good to be here, Kenneth.
So the question we'd like to start off with, which obviously won't take nearly any time at all whatsoever. Actually, no, this one actually won't take any time. I got ahead of myself. I'm already getting my head of self. I haven't even started the episode. Right now, we might be off the clock, but there's got to be something lingering for the next time you've got to go in. What is on the top of your mind for the next time you walk into your arena?
Well, funny enough, it's an email to the Alumni Association about forming an alumni group specifically for esports, funny enough. So you might be getting an email from me
Okay.
In a week or so about that one.
Great.
So that's the first thing on my list for tomorrow.
All right. Well, sounds good then. I'll be on the lookout. For those that don't know, of course, I was a student at Ohio State, but John was never the manager over there while I was there. He came in as I was graduating. So, but it's always been fun to sit here and talk. We've known each other for a little bit now. But on that note, obviously, there is some history to you prior to your current role. What's your story entering into video games at all, then into the esports realm, and then into your current position?
A long tail, and definitely has a lot of twists and turns. Mine started with Command and Conquer. I remember my dad coming home from work, showing me this box. I was far too young, should not have played that game at that age, but that was kind of started my love affair with esports, specifically RTSs and isometric kind of sort of titles. And throughout my childhood, I'd had a lot of times of where I can't go play sports or what have you, and gaming was the answer. I still remember getting my Sega Genesis, the first actual console ever, and my dad putting it into a brown bag, writing lots of socks and underwear on it, putting it under the tree, and then opening it up and getting to play Sonic 2 for the first time. And that really kind of kickstarted it all. I remember in high school meeting my first real friend group that I'm still in contact with today, almost 20 years now, playing the original Dota. So when it was still just a map inside of Warcraft 3, before League of Legends was even close to a thing or anything like that, and continued to play games throughout high school, college. And when I got to graduate school, was when I was a communications student. So I was studying a lot of social movements and online communities. And of course, gaming was a big part of that. I used to play a lot of World of Warcraft MMOs. And so a lot of the things I talk about or research in a class or read a paper is all these things apply exactly to these communities. There's not a lot of in-depth, there's lots of peripheral work going on about what these could be, but there was very little actually going into the communities and studying them. So it's well, why not do that? And so I started not as my primary area. I was more in the political area for social movements, but that's how I got into the research for it. Inevitably, in grad school, you're looking for things to do. You want to get experiences. You're trying to apply what you're learning in these different classes. I was very worried. I didn't want the ivory tower effect. It's all these esports orgs were popping up. And I was lucky enough to be one of the first employees at one as kind of just my service, because I was very familiar with dealing public relations, dealing with those types of things. And so I spent 3.5 years at Tempo Storm working on their website as a web administrator, making YouTube content and the like, and overseeing teams. And I thought it was more of just a something to do on my side while I'm finishing my doctorate and everything else. And I remember going down to Arkansas. It's like, well, I have this position. I'm a professor now. I guess I'm done with esports. I was not done with esports, obviously. And within 6 months, I had gotten into a couple of interesting meetings with the president of the university and then started the first program in Arkansas. And that took me to the rest of the way to where we are today.
Sometimes esports finds you. Isn't that true? As it turns out,
Very true.
I'm sure I'm sure a handful of our listeners can relate to that. Certainly, they always bring you right back in. But all right, let's get into things here a little bit. Obviously, now you're at the Ohio State University. Gotta say it.
Can't forget the D.
That's tradition. Before we get flamed, that's just tradition around here. All right. When you grow up in Columbus for, 22 years of your life, that's what's ingrained in your brain. Um, but you all are playing in a variety of different leagues for your premier teams. Run me through what that slate looks like for this fall and then for this coming spring.
Yeah. We're gluttons for punishment, that's for sure. So we're in the Powered Esports Conference, or PEC. The Big Esports Conference, the VEC, definitely not close for any reason for why they picked those acronyms. We're playing in the CECC for Valorant, as well as for multiple titles. We're playing in CVAL, or will be continuing CLOL in the spring. A variety of we're actually, our Overwatch team is playing in the Blizzard Activision collegiate season that's happening right now, and it's yeah, too many to name, honestly. As you keep going down, we haven't even gotten to the club teams on campus and where they're playing either. So it's an alphabet soup of fun times.
Right. So what? I mean, for Valorant alone, you mentioned CVAL. They're playing in both PC and BEC this semester? So that's
Yep.
already three competitions. Are your students excited and like hyped up for that?
I tried to warn them, hey, we should just go small. No, they want to keep doing more. And I know if I would have said, hey, we can't do CVAL or what have you, I would have had a mutiny on my hands. And so sometimes I have to let them learn the maybe it's a bad idea to do 3 to 4, 5 leagues at once. That has to be a lesson they learn sometimes themselves. So, end of the day, this is still very much a student-centered, student-led activity, and so uh, I'm not going to overrule them until we get into situations where it's like, "I told you so," and then we just move on.
Is that coming up soon, you think?
Uh, I think it is, and I've had it happen before. So it's definitely one of those things. I think in the future, as we grow, we're going to have a lot more like, let's focus on one, maybe two conferences, tournaments at a time. But we're not there yet, and the base of esports has been competing as many as possible and figure it out at later. So we'll see when that changes.
To each their own. I'm sure I can provide, or I have provided a couple of opportunities for my teams, and they're like, yeah, no, we're good. We don't want to compete in that weekend tournament. We'd rather have our weekends, right? So different cultures, or different speeds for different folks, as it turns out there. But um, so how do you then go about prioritizing those leagues? Because obviously, with some of these smaller conferences, you've made pretty commitments to a smaller, tight knit group compared to some of these larger things that might lead into national championships, which I imagine might also be just as relevant and significant for the players. So where do you make that judgment, and where do you view your role to step in and be like, all right, well, it's important for the program to go this route, whereas I understand it's important for you to go this route, and how do you kind of navigate those waters?
Yeah. For me, I really focus on community and future development of the activity are the ones I'm thinking the most. And so, like, I love the fact that there are developers and such that are willing to put time and effort, how much or how little, who knows, into it. But one of the things I know I see myself in kind of the future of the activity is I think those will still be relevant to some degree. But if we really want to have something that's sustainable and more importantly, that we can actually control where it's going to go, that's kind of the part I think is most important. It's getting into and having these conferences that are run by ourselves and not necessarily run by third parties twice removed in more ways than one. And so that's for me, it's like the BEC and the PEC are really the two biggest one. And for me, I love the individuals involved in the PEC. Doc does a great job, is a great guy, works really well. Chris is doing killing it at Michigan State and what have you. Uh, my heart's connected to the BEC in more ways than one. And for me, it's like developing that, and in particular, because as you know very well, most of the Big Ten schools are still student run programs with limited to no recognition, oftentimes on those campuses. That's one reason why I prioritize that, because that is directly helping those programs hopefully get that recognition they need. It's one of the reasons why we did the big land back in April, was to help those programs get that recognition. So for me, that's how I prioritize it. Definitely how well the leagues are run also matter, but that's usually what second or tertiary thing for me.
The rising tide raises all ships, as we like to say, more than in more than one case around here. But then again, right? You talk about the disparity between the structure, maybe, of your program and the resources that someone like Chris is able to pump into the Michigan State program, compared to those club level rosters that maybe don't have that level of formality, don't have that level of structure, and have these students that very drastically change the course of the program year to year. Where does that become a point of tension at all in that smaller conference while you're trying to make decisions and over the course of the season as things start to unfold and some teams just don't stack up?
Yeah. No, it is, and we have had issues of that. There have been schools that have withdrawn or had to pretty much put their competition on hold because team fell apart, or different managers got into a conflict of interest or what have you, right? And I know it's difficult, and especially for some of the other directors or staff that are not full time. Like I am very fortunate to be full time esports. I never thought that would happen. I'd been in the industry in one way or another 10 years. When I was at Henderson, I was a professor 80% of the time and 20% esports. Though it was actually a lot more esports overall, and it can be very frustrating in those situations. But to me, it's more of these are growing pains. We have to, because there's no other way we grow, because no one else is coming to fix everything. It has to be us. And so sometimes that's just the price of growth and having to deal with it. But it does lead to tensions. And sometimes the players and such are like, why are we doing this? Why do we have this strict rescheduling policy? Like, why do we have like those different aspects of it? Because the field is very used to being super practical and hyper fluid. The problem is when you're trying to develop something, so it's not just for you, it's for a larger community. You have to start creating those standards. And especially when I have a lot of students, like I'll talk about kind of comparing us to athletics and things like, okay, if you want to do that comparison, that means we're not rescheduling period anymore.
Yeah.
And we're going to be changing a lot of other things. And so, it's a very tenuous give and take. But I like to think that we try to make sure that everyone's heard. They have a chance to give their piece and how they believe things are doing, and that they understand, like, when we can't make the decision they want, that hey, here's our rationale. This is for good reason, and that they at least feel a part of the process and that they're not forgotten. Because that's the thing I think is the worst and leads to the outcomes that none of us want, is when students feel they don't have a voice, or that their activity is being taken away or changed. Because that's not what uh, any director I've ever talked to wants to have happen. It's just different ways of trying to all get to the same spot and trying to navigate which ones make the most sense at whatever time. Because plenty of ideas I've had that do not pan out, and plenty of ideas students have same wise or work out fine. So trying to balance that, it is very difficult.
I think probably the most important thing is that students do want the voice in the room, right? And they want to be a part of those conversations. You're not going to get leaders at every program every year that want that much input there, but there are absolutely going to be some. When you're talking about a dozen or so, different clubs, there's going to be at least one or two students that want to step up, want to be involved in the process, and want to see the whatever competition continue to grow for those people there that they are trying to help oversee. And I think, coming from the perspective of a student leader as well, I think that voice is incredibly important, and something that rings true. But how do you try to involve them at the higher level of talk when you're talking about those smaller conferences, when you're talking about those competitions? Because obviously their schedules are a nightmare. They're working, they're running a club, they're playing their games in their free time. Oh, by the way, they've got those classes, to worry about too. Where do they have the time, and how do you invite them to be a part of the decision making process?
Yeah, I think a good example of that kind of goes back to when the BEC was founded because it was just really all of us managed to get in the room I think it was about May or June of 2022. Yeah, no, 2023. Yeah, we got it was last year. Yeah, right. Timelines. And
Mhm.
it was making sure that we tried to do our best to schedule things around where they are. We tried to make sure one of the great things about Discord is it's not just a chat platform, it is everything, right? We're able to show voting and have that clearly be there and allowed and have that. We're able to have a variety of different ways in which we can have open hall meetings or at least post that so people can see it. And everyone's going to have different timelines. It's just like you said, like classes, other obligations, jobs, what have you, and try to be as transparent and provide as much time as possible. Sometimes, everyone steps up, gets to the meetings or what have you, or watches the notes that come through. We usually almost always have a VOD or something at least, so people can sit in and watch later on when if they weren't able to make the meeting. It's having those almost catch up mechanics in a way, similar to you might have in a game, so people can still be tuned in. And part of that is we have to work on a longer timeline for certain decisions, which isn't always efficient, but it's necessary in order to keep that larger goal of having that communication and involvement. And there's always every director has different ways of doing that or different thoughts about how much that should be there or how little what have you. And so and that's another part of it is like the different directors having those conversations because I have a very different view of esports compared to even Chris Bilskat. We talk all the time different aspects of it. I love what he's doing and such. Different views though, and the what's my program might be under for pressure of how or what we should develop very different from his, for example. And so you're navigating a lot of different. You're juggling a lot of balls at once, but that's just what you have to do sometimes.
Let's talk about that more, because you mentioned even then, you would think two universities that actually sound like they should have very similar esports programs in the way that they are in the competitions they're electing to enter and the way they present themselves forward between MSU and you all. What are some of those differences? And is there like an example of something that has caused a little bit of a disagreement on where a certain rule should fall, how a certain procedure should be done? Do you have something like that? It doesn't have to be MSU specifically, but something like that, right?
I think for one thing for us is like competition, of course, a key central element of our different aspects of it. But one of the biggest things I've wanted us to try to incorporate, and we haven't figured out how best to do it yet. And I think part of that's just because we often, I find in the esports industry, we say yes sometimes far too often when we don't have the time to do something. I know that far too well. And one of the things I really want us to have at some point is essentially intercollegiate intramurals is the best way to describe it. A queue system very similar to what some of the saying play versus can sometimes bring a lot of different opinions around, but some of the queue systems and stuff that exist at the school level is to me like that is a way to vastly increase the reach that these different conferences and competitions have when you're able to have not just the teams that I oversee, but have like there might be just a group at a dorm that's like, hey, let's all play together and something, right? Much like you would do it in an intramural, but have it be against other schools as well at the same time. Something like a almost casual League of Legends, Valorant, what have Friday tournament that happens through a platform. Like to me, that is one of the most important aspects of esports, especially with these larger institutions, because when you only have those like competitive teams that are at the highest level playing, when you look at numbers, at the end of the day, numbers matter a lot, especially at large institutions. It's a lot of justifying with quantitative analysis. I have about 70 students right now playing throughout our 5 teams, which is great, and we're at highest level I think the program's ever been in that sense. But I know there's so many more on this campus that want to be playing, but feel like, okay, I can't face off against the Immortal 3 guy. I guess I'm not going to be doing esports anymore. It's like, no, that's not the answer at all. Please come back. And trying to find that way. And it's definitely, I think, other schools and stuff and are see the benefit of that, but it isn't at the priority yet. And I think it's more of we just have so many hours in the day than necessarily like a pedagogical difference.
Mhm.
But sometimes when you're having those conversations where competition of that type might be a little bit more important, those are trade-offs that happen.
As an esports program, there's a lot of different ways to grow your presence on campus. But what better way to do it than with merchandise that helps spread the light of college esports? Well, that's where our sponsors of today's episode at Playfly College Esports come in once more. Playfly just announced their free Spring 2025 merch drop, which is available to all participants and includes early access to their latest college esports t shirt release and a sticker pack featuring a selection of their exclusive iconography. Participants are only responsible for shipping and handling. For more details on this and everything else they've announced thus far for this upcoming spring season, scan the QR code on screen right now or visit playflycollege.gg. Thanks once again to Playfly College Esports for sponsoring this episode of Torchbearers. Now, back to my conversation with John. Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point in general about activating more students on campus because this is a participation sport after all, right? The reason why, or in fact, there is research. I have to pull up the citations from one of the essays I did a while ago, but there is research that shows that a lot of times the reason why people are tuning into the highest level of play is to learn and improve their own play, not necessarily just for the entertainment value that could bring. They're also looking for the actual insights they can bring in to their own gameplay because that's where they find just as much enjoyment and finding a way to activate a larger student body on campus to be engaged might be a more and maybe not an easier way to go, but certainly one that can get more people involved rather than just trying to hope you cast the net wide enough to tune into our Twitch broadcast this evening. Um, Whereas now they're actually doing something, they're actually engaged. And maybe you and I have talked about this idea before, but some kind of like more informal league is probably worthwhile. But as you mentioned, we don't have time for that, right? We've got 9 million other things to do, and one of them has to deal with what time is our match actually happening tonight, as we were discussing a moment ago. Um, so yeah, uh that's another whole nother can of worms that we won't get into. But I want to bring us back into the formation of this Power Esports Conference because this is a set of institutions at the Division One level for athletics that appear like they're investing a decent bit into their esports programs. And it seems like that's kind of the general basis for how this group of teams came together. What is it about this conference that kind of drew everyone in? And kind of help flesh that out in terms of the formation of this new thing.
Happy to do that as well as I can. I'll first though I need to correct or at least add to this that Joey at Syracuse, along with Doc and Chris, are I think the three that really came up and have done the most work around it. When the BEC formed and such, myself, Chris, Kevin at that institution up north, as well as Doug Kuhn at Minnesota, were kind of like the four that really kind of came together and were able to get a lot of organizing done. Not to downplay anyone else that's been part of that. And so I was more behind the scenes for that, and of course, with the LAN event, I was doing a lot of work on that side. But the one thing when I remember when Chris approached me about it and talked to me about the idea, I was a little hesitant at first, but as he really explained to me, is like he wanted to work with other people in the collegiate space that he respected, saw that they had similar standards of quality and what they wanted to do, and to really kind of try to push the envelope. And I could understand that, because that's the thing. There is, as we talked about, such a spectrum of programs out there of where they fall on that, from involvement from the administration to student involvement. Kind of like we were talking about before, it can be really difficult to try to form some sense of belonging, or just a sense of like a combined effort moving forward. It often, you can feel like you're just a one person band sitting around and have no idea what the other person is doing, even if they're in a college right across the city you're in, or across the country. And I really respect that, because everybody involved in the PUC, I think they've done a really good job so far at starting their programs, overseeing them. And so it's great to work with those types of individuals that are constantly trying to push the envelope and piling on more things that we probably shouldn't, because we are far too busy as it is, but doing it for the right reasons, like to make esports a sustainable, growing, and great experience for everyone involved.
So, in that way, what do these smaller conferences provide that the larger third parties cannot, right? We've kind of danced around a little bit with this idea of the smaller and more tight knit people working together to try to make something a little bit larger and make something that could potentially be a little bit more nimble and adaptive, and or maybe even experimental without, being afraid of losing a bunch of business, of course. But where are those advantages, and are there disadvantages with going for that kind of a route?
I think one of the disadvantages is when you're starting anything, or whether conference or something else, you are having to put a lot of on the line of your own time, but also of the sense that uh, resources, because it is you. It is essentially those that are in that group. And if you haven't selected the right partners to work with you on this, all of a sudden it's not worth the time anymore once you start going into it. I'm happy to say that has not been the case with PEC or with the BEC, but it's one of those things of where it means there's a lot more riding on a select group of individuals. When you have kind of these amorphous, large national conferences, that gets spread out a bit each year. It allows for things to kind of, you can just kind of, you log onto the website you're using, you check to see what your match times, your opponents are, you check with your opponents, and you go. It's perfect for if you're just starting a program. It's perfect for somebody that you have an administrator that's suddenly like, okay, you're the low person on the totem pole, go run esports now, kind of aspect. Like if you're just getting into it. So I'd understand a program that would rather go towards like the NECC or the NACE or what have you for those aspects, and I wouldn't blame them. I do the same thing. Um, the benefit, I think you've already hit on the head, though, is where you can develop something that's a little bit more. We can have LAN events that are consistent, because that's one of the things that I still remember the amount of backlash that happened with CLUL. Our team had qualified for the round of 32, which was a huge achievement for the program and students, and then found out that we have to get to the top four instead of what I think it was top eight to go to California. And it's like, ooh, that bracket is not looking very good for that. No, so I think it's trying to build that sense of community, because at the end of the day, I know for myself, and I think Kenneth, you as well, it's like we know that what we're doing right now, a lot of the things we're not going to see the results of that until 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years down the line. And actually, I was just at a conference last week, ORSA, which is the Ohio Recreational Sports Association. They were just celebrating 50 years. I remember they had a ton of their old alumni who started it there talking about it. And they did the exact same thing. They just got 17 people together or so for the first one ever, just in a group, having a couple talks about how they run their different recreational sports departments. And that turned into something where it started with 17. And at this conference I was at, there was almost 200 people at 50 years later. And those individuals just being amazed that things had grown so much. I mean, that's what we're doing essentially with these different little groups and such, just trying to start creating that trend, and the hopes it turns into something bigger down the line, and a community that comes from that. And to me, that's one of the those larger kind of conferences. They're going to have similar things in one way or another, but it's not going to be as personable it's not going to have that element. And that's not to say you can't, those aren't going to be, those types of conferences aren't useful. There are national organizations. ORSA is connected to NERSA, which is the larger national organizing body for recreational sports. But it is that feeling like what keeps you involved years after you're there, when you're gone off and you've graduated and you're working the real world. It's those relationships that you are going to remember. It's less going to be the competition, though. I'm sure you'll have like the, oh, one time I got ganked by the jungler in X game or what have you memory still, but that's, it's not as meaningful and more important, impactful as those other relationships in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to talk about impactful relationships. How about the opportunity to go to a LAN and meet people from other institutions where you get now to actually see people? And that's something that you can't do at the national level, right? It's just infeasible to attempt to try to get even 8 teams per game into one specific area, which of course CECC does every year, but they also don't run a full league every year, right? They run a
That's true.
very different
Mhm.
model in order to get to that exact moment. I also think it's interesting to, yeah, I mean, you brought up recreational conferences. I was actually just at Warsaw. They actually came to Green Bay for us. So, my month 2 on the job, and here I am sitting amongst recreation folks. And I'm like, hi, I do esports stuff, and none of you are esports people, and that's fine. But even still, it's interesting to look back on that and reflect on the fact that remember those college sports were in these shoes not incredibly long ago. Of course, not long ago enough to the point where no one else in the room is going to remember anything. But even still, like you're only looking a little farther down the road when you're looking towards, especially the recreation side of things,
Mhm.
for where that has kind of developed on college campuses. And there are differences, of course. Online play allows us to do a lot else, but we're not actually looking that far down the road. We're only looking at where things can potentially go from there. And that maybe leads me to the question of a national championship. Because for these universities that might opt to just play a regional conference or just play those smaller conferences, suddenly they're not in contention for a national title. Despite the fact that there are like 5 national titles up for grabs at any given game title. So what is the value of being a part of that competition? And how do you explain to your players that maybe some other, like, which one's more valuable, right? That's the other thing. I mean, we could go on so many different tangents about how you explain to players X, Y, or Z thing, right? Including, like, hey, we're trying to build this thing so it's here in 20 years. Well, player doesn't want to hear that, right? They just want to go win a national title now.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, we go on pretty long with that conversation, that's for sure. No, and you bring up a good point, and I know some of the controversies that surrounded Division One esports and what have you has focused on those aspects. And I know, at least from my experience, when I talk to directors and that topic, and it comes up at some point, I don't know of any directors that have this idea that their the conference they're in that's regional is replacing those. And kind of like we talked about earlier, like I know most of my players very much have want to compete on that national stage, want the chance to. And hey, I completely understand that. I think the place where it really becomes important is for, especially I think large institutions like the Ohio State University and some of the others in these areas. I know the aspect I'm thinking of not only is the sense of getting together, but it's also how am I going to be using our competition side of things and translating that and trying to convey the success that my players are having, our students are having, to administration. And that's definitely part of like aspect of it. And at the end of the day, it's because of those aspects that why having one of those small regional conferences in addition, and that's the important thing I want to say, it's in addition. I think you really can't just have that. And you think about it, even for like, again, using athletics as we brought up earlier, we have a lot of those conferences that are quote unquote not power four conferences that exist in there, that because of the way the, like we'll use football because that's the one that's going on right now, because of how that operates, still technically have a chance to theoretically get pulled and picked in for it. But I think the larger aspect comes down to is that recognition, being able to kind of show not administration, alumni, and inevitably students their success and showcase what they've been able to accomplish over time. And so it's one of those things of where uh, we're not trying to claim a national championship or something from playing in these small conferences or what have you. I don't think anyone's trying to say that. And if they were, I would correct them just as much as anyone else would, right? I know that if we hit a Maryville and such, it's going to be a difficult game regardless of what it is. And I don't want to take that away from any of those institutions that have sat down and been able to put those resources and that see the future of esports. And hey, I wish we had that type of commitment as well, or at least that level of kind of the competition side. But the important thing to know, and it's really hard for students to see that. And I think that's something uh, you understand as well, Kenneth. That like when you're in undergraduate or even as a grad student, there are so many gears turning, so many resources that are being um, fought over is honestly the thing. It's like politics. So a lot of zero sum that's happening of negotiations and such. And at big institutions, that's even even more and a lot more things that are completely out of your hands. And so you have to make decisions of okay, this might not be the most popular option for my students and such. They're not going to like it, but I know years down the line, conversations where like we're trying to find funding to go travel or what have you, these actions, these steps are going to pay dividends there. And it's really hard to pull back the curtain and show the community that. And that's one of the things I do wish we could have more transparency in some of those conversations and the like. But it comes to larger aspects about where the focus of esports is competition wise, and they're not easy conversations because they're happen to be very practical, and sometimes being practical is not fun. But it's what we have to do if we want to keep the activity growing and being here. Because at the end of the day, I mean, that's the most important thing I'm thinking about. It's like, how do we keep this going and not to the next generation that's going to come in and give them the keys to do more than I ever could or whoever will be in this seat in the future. We want to give them as many legs up as possible so they don't have to go through all this again when they get here.
Please no. Please no. I remember doing all that. Please no. We don't. I don't want to send anyone else through that, and that's why I wrote a 28-page transition guide on how to be a president of a club. Anyway, so the next question then becomes, um, when does it become time for there to be multiple different conferences that all have a selection committee where they pick the best 32 teams to all face off at an end of year tournament? Wait a minute. This sounds familiar.
Yeah, no, it's like there've been developments or systems that have been created over 150 plus years of history that have dealt with competitions and negotiating those interesting aspects and have had some of these arguments. I actually, funny enough, last week I had a meeting with my premier players and such, and I had a timeline of when the first football game was played at college, which was 1871 between what I think Harvard and Oh no,
Yeah.
Harvard and Yale. Oh god, I would have got a lot of trouble for that one. Screwed that one. Harvard and Yale, and to even the formation of the precursor to the NCAA, which was 50-ish years later, pretty much, and the like. So it's never fun to have to say, hey, like, we're very young. I know that like as an industry and such, I mean, 10 years since the first collegiate esports program formed. That's not something students want to hear. And heck, it's not something I like to hear either, right? It's kind of like, oh, we have to be okay with slow growth and what have you. Or I shouldn't say slow. I should say steady, consistent growth is what we want to be looking for. And that's just because that's where esports kind of comes from and stuff. We're kind of trying to adjust our sense of time and scale because it's a lot more than something that's kind of grassroots grown up. We're trying to integrate well established institutions with something that to them is a blink of the eye for us, where it's been our entire lives, right? And those are two different points of view that can be very difficult to square, especially when you put passion. When you put passion to anything, everybody it's a lot of investment and in the sense of just mental emotions, and sometimes it makes decision making difficult because it feels like, am I betraying this what I'm doing because of this decision? Am I not following along? And that's something I do think about a lot because at the end of the day, what this is it's that what makes it so that I never have to worry about looking for student workers who work at the esports arena, or I don't have to worry about those elements, is because it's that passion and trying to maintain that while also making sure the support is going to be there moving forward. Because that's something the field, as we both know, still has not figured out fully. And one day, but that's why we have things like this, where we're trying to get those ideas together to figure out what is the right path forward. Because there's no book on it yet.
As John just mentioned, esports is built on passion, and we know that you all need the energy to keep on building. Sometimes, though, you also need to help channel that passion to some very specific tasks. Well, our sponsors of today's episode at Neuroptima believe they have a product that can help. You see, their flow state isn't just another quick energy fix. It's designed to help you focus longer, stay sharp, and actually feel better, and does it by combining nearly 5 times the nootropics of traditional energy supplements with both instant and delayed release caffeine to fuel your brain and body. It's like energy redefined, basically. Smarter, cleaner, and built to keep you going for longer with game changing cognitive enhancement. If you're still downing those energy drinks, it might be time to rethink what you're using to stay on top of your game. Of course, Neuroptima not too long ago sent me some of their raspberry lemonade flow state flavor, and I'm almost all the way through the sample that they sent me. I'll definitely be ordering more because I believe in the product, and I believe after you try some, you might too. If you want to check it out for yourself, you can go to neuroptima.gg and use code CEN at checkout for 10% off your order. Thanks again to Neuroptima for sponsoring this episode of Torchbearers. Now, let's return to our passion project with John. I think it's easy, especially in the age of social media and the internet, to see exactly how much greener you think the grass is greener, how much greener the grass is on the other side of the coin. And um, given by the fact that we are in an internet age, right? It feels like I can just pull in a bunch of people from thin air to make something larger and make something. Oh, but I know they're right there. I know this is possible because I can still connect to them. Whereas you have to remember that the reason why these kinds of things are in place for athletics is because they had to go based off of who was in their state, who was in their region of the United States, which now, of course, has got out the window, which is, again, a whole other conversation for sport management courses and master's programs. Um, but, uh, you've got this wide variety of people and this wide variety of perspectives that can try to be tapped into. And it's frustrating to be like, well, why can't I just reach those people? Why can't I just make something because I already know that there's 300 some odd programs across the country, right? That have this, and that number is still growing. Um, so I think it's especially difficult from the student perspective. And this is something even that as a just recent student, right, I could relate to be like, the second that you get out of you finish your bachelor's, maybe you've gone on to your grad, whatever the case is, you view time much differently. So all of the sudden, it feels like it is not year by year that things go by. It is multiple years by multiple years as you keep getting older, which I think is also something from a perspective of the student seems asinine, right? Like, what? How is that possible that in a decade I would think that we have skyscrapers that have screen windows that can flip around to block out the light or let in however much you want, and then put whatever other weather forecast up you want on the screen just for the sake of it. But the reality is that's not the way time flows, and that is something that also causes a decent amount of tension as we've been cycling around it this whole episode with how you
Mhm.
relate to students. Um, so I don't know. I think it's something where trying to find that balance is difficult, especially when students believe and demand their voice be heard just as much as they do now.
Yeah, it's not easy to negotiate, and it's very easy for people in administration stuff to become jaded because of that, and that they don't see people's that they feel like they're not seen for all the work they do, and then that passion leaves, and then they go do something else. That's something that I know has already affected programs in the country and will continue to do so because it's something that affects every activity that exists at a college or high school level. Because and it's one of those things of where I don't have enough time with my players. I can't go to much of any practice. I know that's something you're finding out yourself as well. I have to work the normal hours, right? I have to go to these meetings and deal with budgets or deal with different aspects of mark brand standards or go volunteer and work with other parts of the department to help them out when they need it, right? Because it's no longer just you're part of a larger community, which is you have your esports community, your gaming community that's on campus that you're part of, but you're also now part of the staff that are on campus, the larger faculty. You're working with those alumni that are interacting and being a part of it, not even including business community research, right? There's just so many things that pull your time away. And I know for a lot of directors that are first starting off or have been asked to take a role that they weren't even comfortable with doing originally or didn't have any background, it can be really difficult and it very easy for them to slowly just write it off, or at least not put as much time or effort warranted to it because they don't have the bandwidth, and it's not their problem sort of element. It's very easy, and I've seen individuals who I know must have had passion at some point or had that drive that clearly over 10, 20 years it's slowly been worked out of them because they've seen so many of the same issues come up again and again and nothing happened. And when the students when the students traditionally like every 4 years rotate out, that's really hard for, especially when those students are key leaders. It's not easy for the student group, but it's also difficult for the staff and such that work with those students because that's a revolving door that unless you've already had a lot of leadership training, which is one of those things that I know esports communities and clubs they don't have enough of. It's one of those things of where we've had to reinvent the wheel in so many things, but we really need to borrow from some of those that have done this a bit longer. Not because but sometimes we feel like, oh, it's esports, it's us. We need to be the ones to write it. And it's like leadership's the same everywhere. There's a reason why it's taught the way it is, but sometimes we have to run into the wall head first to learn ourselves, and then we can fix it. But it's still painful.
Sometimes we have to run into the wall head first, figure out that that wasn't the way to do it, and then look around for the helmet that allows us to run into the wall head first. Which, I think we all have done at some point or another. That's just the nature of the beast, as it turns out. There are some things we just expect to be a certain way, and that isn't entirely true. Um, since we're on the topic, we've kind of gone off on a tangent, but what advice do you have for people who might be starting to lose that passion in a role where their job is to try to serve students?
Mm.
What do they do next, right? If they feel like they're just trying to grasp onto something for dear life.
That's a good question, and I've definitely had moments myself like that at my previous institution, as well as even here at Ohio State. I know one of the things I do, and it seems like a small one, but I take a lot of walks around campus. And for me, it's to put things in perspective. Like 5 years ago, I would never have dreamed I'd be doing what I'm doing. 10 years ago, same thing, even more so. I am pretty sure my jaw just would have completely dropped off the face of the earth, sort of aspect of it. But because putting things in perspective is really important. It's so easy to get bogged down in the day to day of dealing with scheduling issues, dealing with IT issues that are happening, dealing with trying to like get that one administrator you've been trying to have a conversation with to talk about X, Y, or Z project forever and still not getting a response back or what have you. it's trying to just remember where you've been and where things have been, just the perspective of it. And for me, walks are where that really helps. I get to see kind of what I'm a part of, the larger campus. That this isn't just esports, but this is part of a much larger tradition. That is the school you're at, the community you're a part of, the city you're a part of. Right. That's even another aspect as well. Um, doesn't always work, but it helps a lot. And I think the second key thing I'd recommend is uh, the great thing about esports is I think despite whatever we're doing, esports is going to be here in some way, shape, or form. I don't think we're not going to be rolling back the clock and suddenly no one's doing it. It's never going to be at that point. And so not as much is riding on you as you might think, because that's one of the things I know for myself. I often feel like, okay, we need to do this. You kind of get the what is it? Main character syndrome, feeling like everything you're doing is so super important and such. And sometimes that's great for motivation and working through difficult times, not for long term mental health. And knowing that sometimes, hey, it's okay to let certain things change, slip away, or not do, or try to find other ways of doing it that aren't as involving. Like I know we had to cut back like early on at BC. Kevin was trying to do all the broadcasting himself, and it's like he couldn't do that. It was way too much time for him. In addition to his job, because he's got a situation of where he's like technically like 10 or 20% esports, but primarily intramurals, and that takes enough time as it is. I respect people infinitely more than I did before I ever stepped into intramurals. When I got here, I understand just how much work and the amount of abuse in the sense of just dealing with officiating, dealing with a lot of the similar things we deal with esports, just in a different medium and a different activity. And he ended up stopping. He's like, okay, we're until we figure out a way where we compensated for time, we can hire and actually pay students instead of just having volunteers. Which, don't get me wrong, volunteerism very important, but something anyone that's been in this activity long enough knows is that you can't just rely on volunteerism forever, because slowly it devalues what it is you're doing. And the other thing is that those that are making those decisions on budgets are like, well, you did it without a budget last year. Why can't you do it without a budget again this year? And it's like, oh, that's why we probably shouldn't rely on this forever. So yeah, it's an important thing to remember that you're not the only one carrying this burden. You're not the only one that's doing it. You're part of a larger group, and it's okay to have to scale back sometimes.
I think that's one of the frustrating points too, is it feels like so often as the program leader, in a lot of cases where you are the only full-time staffer overseeing competitive teams and the people that come in your door to just have their casual gaming and all those other things, that it feels like you are the bottleneck, right? Where you've got the pressure coming in from the students that all want certain things that are all going to benefit them, and then you've got the pressure from administrators to not change everything about what you're doing and trying to fight up and release the valve where you can to let a little bit of that pressure through so that you can get some work done. And at the end of the day, you can't do everything, right? And I think that is something that I am trying to figure out now as, one of my, or my first role, right, coming into this is, all right, where is that happy medium? Where is that balance? Um, but the reality is, our jobs sometimes aren't all up to us, right? It's up to the administration and whatever they believe that the program should look like. And I guess the next question becomes, as we look at how administration views collegiate esports, where does the value for them at your institution take shape? And how do these, maybe tying back around to get back on topic, how do these smaller conferences help provide that kind of value that they're looking for, specifically for schools like yourself at the D1 level?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'll start with kind of the conference side, and I'll work my way back from there, because I think they're interconnected. But specifically with the conference one, it comes down to a big part of it is name recognition. Don't get me wrong, I love Slippery Rock College, but playing them in esports and us winning or playing Maryville and winning even um, doesn't move the needle the same way it would otherwise. And, there's part of me in the competition side of thing that just really doesn't like that. But at the same time, it's when you think about it, it's like there are so many clubs, activities that are happening at any given university. When you start trying to think about just how many, think about all the small aspects that even in our industry and in these different aspects that unless you're paying attention all the time and have like the necessary background and understanding of it, you couldn't get what's going on in a small piece of time. Add that in where we're one very, in the grand scheme of things, small community. It's starting uh, at these different institutions. You start to understand why having name recognition and such with like that really does help and makes it so not only for staff, administration, alumni, students that are on campus that aren't involved in the activity at all, they can get excited about, right? And so there are some selfish reasons, of course. I think you'd be lying if you didn't acknowledge that and understand it. And but that's part of the reason why a lot of those conferences that we're essentially trying to base ourselves off of, those athletic conferences, developed in those ways. Is that they're region? The reason they're region based is because everyone knew what they were. Everyone knew what those areas were, and we do live in a different age with the internet and what have you. So those barriers that we once had of geographic barriers don't exist, especially with gaming and esports in its history. But we're not just the gaming community. We're part of the larger community of those campuses that we're a part of. And to the larger aspect of what those priorities are, I know for us, it's much more student engagement. It's the numbers in the sense of how many students are we working with, how many students are coming and visiting our facility, how many students are part of not just the premier teams here, but part of all the club teams and part of all the kind of intramural aspects that clubs like the Buckeye Gaming Collective do and what have you. And for them, that's where those numbers and that's where the priority really is. It's the engagement of the students here on campus. And after that, it's the greater community, it's alumni, it's other different parts of the university, it's working with professors, developing classes, which, finally getting starting this next spring. Um, those are the things that become really important. I want them to have the same passion I do and care for the competitive side in the sense of like getting to the highest level of the national championship. We're just not there yet. And I think the way you can understand that or have a better grasp of what we're dealing with is think about even for athletics. How many different students on campus don't care about athletics? Or how many different professors or staff might not watch sports ball at all on Saturday, right? And you kind of understand it's like, oh, it's not just us that has that problem sometimes. Think about the every single like the vast how football programs oftentimes pay for 10, 20, 30 other varsity sports that are going on from it that don't get the recognition that you don't have to worry about signing up your kid when they first get born for season tickets to get in the line, right? Where you want to go watch basketball or watch a wrestling meet, it's free or they're almost paying you to go, right? And now it's like, oh dear God, it's a lot different than we thought. And it's not fun when you make that realization, but now you better understand what we're dealing with and the context of what we have to build. Um, I know before this we talked a bit about like alumni associations and finally starting one for esports here at Ohio State. That's how competitive sports at collegiate level made its name. It's because alumni who had been part of those groups, those student-run groups that came back and supported it so that those groups could be better than they were when they were there. And we have to do the same thing because that's how we get into that be that system. If we're aspiring and want to be like a system, it's like we kind of have to take the lessons that system had, and we still know that system has plenty of problems, but we still need to take the ones that make sense and apply them to what we're doing.
And a lot more work we have to do in that way, across the board, whether that be for ironing out our own little competitions or figuring out how best to run the facility and engage a larger group of students. All different things that I'm sure many of us struggle with on the day to day. John, the One of the last questions we like to ask our folks here is kind of the consistent closer is perhaps obviously we've been talking about it all day, but if you could snap your fingers and change one thing about the collegiate esports landscape, what would that be?
Um, Great question. I, I'll pick one that I think is close for the organizing aspect that we've been talking about today. I would get rid of the modern kind of need for prize pool that we keep seeing in the collegiate space. I understand why, and I get it full heartedly that the idea of it because it comes back from where esports came from. It came back from grassroots of just people getting together in a space and just pooling in. I always think about Smash. It's a community I love. Terrible at it. I haven't been good since like 64, so it's been a while. Uh, but like one thing I know, I sort of, especially in Arkansas, like we had to get a law passed. We had to change the law so we could have it so potentially these Smash tournaments could run without us having legal issues as state entities, right? Like it, dealing with prize pools or at least finding some way to make it so like through scholarships, through what have you, um, would allow for so many more organizing elements of it. And for not focusing on, well, whether or not this goes and has a prize pool, because that's a question I've had to deal with. It's like, well, there's no prize for this. Why are we doing it? It's like, we gotta sit down. Let me get my PowerPoints. We're gonna have a long conversation. You're about to learn about collegiate sports. Like that would be great because gonna be a difficult one ever because I know what it's like to be a broke college student. I understand that completely, and it's hard to the fact that esports essentially grew up by showing, oh, look, you can win all this money playing it, right? You can win $28 million. You play Dota 2, or what have you. And it's important to understand the reason those companies and such did that, invested in those ways, was to get those headlines so people would be engaged and stay around. But if you look at it, even those prize pools that were first pulling in those big numbers, that were first really like starting to push esports pretty hard back in like the early 2010s and the like, when Ninja's a household name or what have you understand that those were marketing tools and they're useful, very useful. But we're not at that place anymore. We're trying to now make the structure so that we can continue to do that because those were risks, those were gambles that were being done. And sometimes they paid off, many times they did not. And that's the other thing to remember. See how many of those events are still around, even close to that scope, and you start to see, oh, that did not work as well as we thought it did. You might have been inspired, but that did not end up translating for them. And that's the history of every industry, though. When you get back to it, is where you're going to have a lot of those failures and what have you. But I want us to learn that lesson sooner so that we don't have as many of them, and so we can get on to the next. And definitely, so that'd be the one I think I would snap my fingers and change.
Conversations I know the space is actively having, Sean, across the board. So excellent insight there. Any other closing, wrapping thoughts here for us? This has been a fantastic conversation back and forth, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed a little insight into what it is about once a year when I sit down in John's office for fun. Any other closing thoughts here?
Um, for those that are getting into the activity or those that are in it and feel lost, make sure you reach out and to others that are in it, whatever that capacity. Even if you don't know them, send an email, just reach out because that's one of the things that we really need to do a bit better is not only just checking in, but being willing to engage and have those conversations. And I know it's one of those things that so like having conference events like NACAD, having some of the other national conventions that are happening um, are amazing for. I know last week when I went to that workshop that was sponsored by it, I just went in. I had a presentation about esports. I was like, it was pretty milk toast. It was a combination of a few things I'd already presented, and so I was like, oh, I wasn't super excited. But when I was there and I was just listening to other presentations, there was a keynote speaker that was a former student at the University of Dayton that had gone through the recreational sports department and had went from being a varsity soccer player to a club soccer player and completely like discovered themselves through this recreational department to the point of where they completely formed their professional lives. And just hearing this individual speak, clearly very passionate and very like being back, quote unquote, home for first time in like a decade to be able to talk about how much that department impacted them was moving. And it reminded me that it's something I think I didn't want to jump in, but it was way earlier when you were talking is like recreational sports. They know the rhythm of what we're doing already. They just don't have the language yet. They don't have the vocals. And I remember I was just like listening to these, I'm just kind of like, it probably should have been more obvious, but hey, that's sometimes, the lightning strikes whenever it does, so you have to work. I remember it was after the social in there, and I spent 3 hours on the presentation completely rewriting it because like I saw this like, oh, this is the connection. This is how we justify esports. And this is how I can sell esports to any recreational sports person that's willing to let me sit in front of them and talk for a bit, which danger for them because they're going to be stuck there for a while.
It's about the lives we change with the flame we bear. John, thank you so much for joining us here for this episode of Torchbearers.
It's a pleasure to be here, Kenneth. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You just listened to an episode of Torchbearers by College Esports News. Before we go, we want to thank our sponsors one more time. Playfly College Esports just released their Spring 2025 Roadmap to Registration, which details several major changes coming to their competitions next year. Schools can submit their varsity applications for the upcoming Spring 2025 season and for the 2025 through 2026 academic year now, and register for all competitions starting on December 10th. Details on the spring merch drop and Tournament of Champions at CECC May Madness will be available in the coming weeks. You can scan the QR code on screen right now or visit www.playflycollege.gg for more information. And also, real quick, Neuroptima's flow state is redefining what energy and focus feels like. Flow state isn't your typical energy fix and isn't pumping you full of just sugar and caffeine. Flow state combines ingredients like alpha GPC, new LVL, and huperzine A to boost focus, mental clarity, and even your memory and learning. It's also designed to keep you in the zone for longer with both instant and delayed release caffeine to give you real sustained energy that fuels both your body and mind. If you're looking for real mental clarity and performance that lasts, check out Neuroptima's flow state. Your brain will thank you. You can use code CEN at their website, neuroptima.gg, to get 10% off your order. Thanks again to Neuroptima and Playfly for sponsoring this episode of Torchbearers. Once again, thanks to our guest, Dr. John Price, for joining us in this episode. As always, I was your host, Kenneth Brasina. Jared Vanderweel is our project manager, Ashton Lewis is our graphic designer, V Tran is our editor, Sheridan Shea helped record this episode, and Derek Santiago is creative director of CEN. Be sure to follow us on X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram to stay up to date on all things college esports. And check out our website at collegeesportsnews.org. Thanks for listening, and keep carrying the flame.